Thanks for listening to the Open Discourse podcast. In this series, ODC co-founder and CEO Charles Mitchell sits down for a candid conversation with thought leaders, elected officials, entrepreneurs, and more. Today, he is joined by Peter Lipsett, Vice President of Donors Trust.
Peter Lipsett, thank you so much for being my guest on the Open Discourse podcast. As I recall, you are the only guest so far with whom I've ever been involved in a snowball fight. It's great to see you, my friend.
It's an honor to be here.
Now, one thing we could talk about is you and I have been friends for a long time and we have a lot of history. But instead, I'd like to talk about the Ford Foundation. Why do I bring that up, Peter Lipsett? Because many of the folks who are involved with the Open Discourse Coalition tell me that in their generosity, in their philanthropy, they don't want to create another Ford Foundation. They don't want the intent of their philanthropy to be subverted after they are no longer able to oversee it themselves. You know that story. What probably most of our listeners don't yet know about you is that you spend all day helping people ensure their charitable intent is followed as long as they want it to be, sometimes for decades and decades and decades after their passing. You're the vice president of Donors Trust, one of the largest donor-advised funds in America. Can you share more about how you and your colleagues help avoid more Ford Foundations?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And kudos to the donors who are thinking about this, who are trying to actively avoid this, because frankly, there's a lot of donors who don't think about that. That's how you end up with the Ford Foundations and Rockefeller Foundations. And you don't have to be a billionaire to have your money go astray, right? So let me start with the story. Our original founding donor at Donors Trust was somebody who had money at the Seattle Community Foundation, which is no bastion of conservative thought, right? But he was a good conservative. And he, in conversations with Kim Dennis, who is still our chairman and one of the co-founders, really said, we need a conservative donor advised fund, yada, yada, yada. That leads to Donors Trust. He's our initial funder because of this idea of donor intent. He really wanted to make sure that the dollars that he had earmarked for charity, both in life, but also after he was gone, got to the organizations he cared about, right? Didn't drift away. He trained up his daughter to steward the fund after he died. She did a great job, but we also were partners in that. We knew what to do. Well, that's all great. So you can use a donor advised fund with somebody you trust to do that. I recently learned the other side of the story, which is this gentleman had a brother, and his brother, who our founding donor long tried to bring into Donors Trust, and it just never worked out because he said, no, I'm going to work with this bank. And I wouldn't call the bank out anyway, but I can't remember the name of it. But he set up a foundation within a bank and used it and started giving it away, set up, indicated some kids that were supposed to be part of stewarding that after he died. Well, he died, and the bank essentially just kind of took it over as its own piggy bank. It didn't have the rules around it. That the bank, whatever its structures are, I've not seen the paperwork. I don't know how this happened, but the family was shut out. The bank took it. The donor intent was gone. It essentially uses that money to steward its own ideas instead of this brother. And that is just how easy it can go if you're not working with somebody where you really trust them and where the mission is just really, really clear. And so again, kudos to the donors that you're talking about who are at least thinking about this. And the next step is put those donor intent ideas on paper. Make sure whoever is going to steward that charitable legacy for you has those written instructions. And ideally that there's some kind of check on those people to make sure that things don't go astray because it can.
That's so important, Peter. Donor intent has to be sacrosanct when we're talking about philanthropy, and it's a tragedy that so often it's not. Since that founding donor, can you just give a little sense of context? Again, listeners to this podcast, they've heard of Schwab, right? They've heard of some of those brand name financial institutions that have spun off DAFs. But as a donor once asked me, is Donors Trust you and a couple of friends in your garage? Could you give a sense of the scale of what it is today?
Yeah, we have a full office suite, no garage necessary. No, so Donors Trust is the oldest and largest donor advised fund that's focused on conservative and libertarian donors. We are big tent to what you can broadly call the right. And we want to, with donor intent really at the core of what we do. Last year, we gave away about $330 million to causes ranging from public policy or groups like Open Discourse to churches and civic groups and medical groups, education, etc. We've got about $1 billion in assets, but we have a very active donor base that of several hundred donors that want to get their dollars out there. They actually don't just want to be philanthropic, and that's great. Anybody who has a donor advised fund hopefully wants to be philanthropic. But these are donors that really want to change the world for the better towards the ideas of limited government, personal responsibility, free enterprise, and whether they're all in on public policy or just all in on having good civil discourse and civil society, those are the donors we want to work with. And they're active, they're excited. And one of the things we try to bring to the table is A, that donor intent, B, helping to recommend organizations to them that may align with that donor intent so that they can really have an impact with the values that they care about.
Peter, one thing you mentioned is donor advised funds are a great vehicle for giving and that you encourage your account holders to give. I'm sure you know one of the things that is said out there about donor advised funds, for the record, my wife and I have two, so we're believers. One of them is at Donors Trust, so there's my conflict of interest statement. And as listeners, I think have now heard, the reason I invited you here is not that I'm an account holder or that we're friends, although both of those things are true, but because you are an expert on some really important issues that folks associated with the Open Discourse Coalition are wrestling with. And as we'll get to a little bit later, some things that they may not know, but they should be wrestling with, which is some big changes that are happening in charitable giving December 31st of this year. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to just follow up quickly on that thing that you said, that you encourage account holders to give and that your account holders gave $330 million last year. Is there any truth to the claim that's out there that donor advised funds are just a tax shelter, that people just want the deduction and then the money sits and it doesn't actually go to really good causes like the Open Discourse Coalition?
So is there truth to it? Probably in some cases, just like there's some truth that there's actually conservative professors at colleges sometimes, right? You know, just because they're a rarity doesn't mean that they're the rule. You can change that one for the better. Really, people use donor advised funds to give to charity. Any dollar that goes into a charitable account like a donor advised fund has to go to charity eventually. Do some of them set it up in a rush to check a tax box in a year? Yeah, probably. And then they have money to give to charity. And good donor advised funds are encouraging that outflow. And even at Fidelity and Schwab and Vanguard and these larger commercial donor advised funds, they have in recent years actually pushed their donors to be more active. So, you know, you're right, it is a complaint that is lodged against the broader industry of donor advised funds. I don't think it holds water. Again, there's always your bad apples, but those bad apples still have to give that money to charity. And, you know, with us, it's a pretty active donor base. About 80% of the dollars that come in any given year go out that same year at Donors Trust. So our client base, and generally you'll see that with the more mission-driven donor advised funds, you know, groups like ours or National Christian Foundation or Knights of Columbus or on the left, you know, your Arabellas and your Tides Foundation, the ones that are more focused on a values-based mission generally move those dollars a little bit faster because they're donors that actually want to see some change in the world.
That's a really telling statistic, Peter. On the subject of donor intent and ensuring that your values are respected, is there an example that comes to mind for you of a donor who has really done it well? We talked about the negative examples, right? Ford and others, but could you give an example, whether it's in higher education or not? We'll get to higher education in a minute, but could you give an example of somebody in your mind who's really done it right?
You know, this is going to sound like I'm praising this because it ties to our board chair, but, you know, Dan Cyril was a guy who made a lot of money in the pharmaceutical industry and used those dollars to set up a foundation, the Cyril Freedom Trust, which is a great foundation that's actually sunsetting at the end of this year. And Dan had a pretty clear mission. He didn't want to fund a bunch of things all across the board. He was actually very passionate about economic education. He was very passionate about good higher ed centers that could actually, do good and advance the ideas of liberty and freedom and open conversation. Some science in there as well, and public policy. And the foundation really hewed to that. And Kim Dennis was tapped to lead that. And I know has stewarded that for 25 years with, and this is very important, with a goal of sunsetting the foundation. Like I mentioned, it's sunsetting this year. That means it is closing its doors. It is giving away its very last dollar. This is something you've seen a number of times on more conservative foundations, more often, I think, than left-leaning ones, like the Olin Foundation, Earhart Foundation. They have had a mission of closing their doors and sunsetting. And the value of that, Charles, is that you get to punch above your weight. If you can be Olin Foundation, John M. Olin Foundation was a good example of this. And they did a lot of funding in the higher education realm as well. That I can't remember the exact numbers. Let's say it was a $30 million foundation, but it only had 20, 25 years to give all that money away. They weren't hewing to that 5% ceiling or floor of what to give away. They were doing much more of that, which meant they were giving away as much money as a $200 million foundation, so they could punch above their weight. And I think this is something for donors to consider. Yes, it's nice to want to have something that lasts in perpetuity, that keeps your name out there forever, but perpetuity is a long time. And things change. And, even in our world, we've seen think tanks close their doors that we never thought would actually close their doors. We've seen colleges in the higher ed world close their doors. Colleges aren't supposed to close. And yet these are the things that can happen when you think forever is really forever. And so thinking between 10 and 25 years of sunsetting a foundation or a donor advised fund actually allows you to punch above your weight and to really move the needle toward the impact you want.
We've seen such institutions close their doors. We've also seen them change their values and change their mission. And I would argue that's just as much of a problem as it relates to donor intent. If you leave money to an institution and it all of a sudden starts doing things that you never would have supported, that your intent's not being honored there.
Right.
What on all that point, Peter, it sounds like what you're recommending is best practice to donors who want to see that their intent is honored. They were really, well, I would argue, two Presbyterians talking, eventually there's going to be 3 points. One, Dan Searle picked a leader who knew him, who was going to execute his intent until it was over, and that's Kim Dennis, whom you've mentioned a couple of times. Two, there was a very strong written statement of intents and values that the board was required to honor. And three, you hammered this pretty hard, the sunset. It was not a perpetual organization. In fact, as I understand it, just in the very recent past, they had their last board meeting. Those three ingredients, at least I find, I don't do what you do, but I do have a fair number of conversations about philanthropy. The third one is pretty hard for people to swallow. It feels like best practice or common practice or legacy or whatever in philanthropy is perpetuity, perpetual endowments. Even if you don't start a family foundation or whatever, perpetual endowments are very, very common in higher education. I don't need to tell you, you know that. It just feels to me like that sunsetting is the hardest thing for people to swallow. What do you say to someone, let's go further into that. What do you say to someone who's really struggling with that as to why it's so important, why it's a good idea, why it's worth giving up maybe what feels like some real legacy by doing what Dan Searle did?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I kind of mentioned, the think tank I was particularly thinking of was FreedomWorks, right? FreedomWorks has been around a long time, real important piece of the grassroots infrastructure of kind of the conservative movement. And literally last year, it just closed its doors, kind of out of nowhere. And there are people in our pantheon of clients who have FreedomWorks written into their donor intent statement. And we, frankly, on us, we need to go back and figure out who they are. and make sure that that's not listed anymore. And part of the reason to use a group like Donors Trust or somebody you trust is they can, if that's still in there, you can pivot to find what is that next best example. I think back to my own college. I went to Davidson College, and I think of some of the dorms that are named after people, the Duke dorm and the Belk dorm, et cetera. Eventually, one of those dorms is going to get knocked down, right? Somebody gave a lot of money to have their name on that dorm, but that's just the natural cycle of things. The building isn't going to last forever. The chair that has been endowed, the subject may become, the chair in underwater basket weaving at some of these colleges, right? Maybe eventually they won't be teaching underwater basket weaving. So times change. And I think one of the best ways to help people get their head around the perpetuity thing is to figure out what they care about and find those examples of the things that have changed. So, hey, if you had made this will and died 10 years ago, you wouldn't have foreseen this. And your dollars would either continue to go to something that's defunct or would just be used for whoever is controlling the money for whatever their purposes are. And you really need to guard against that.
So, Peter, speaking of things that have changed, anybody listening to this conversation would agree that higher education has changed a great deal in recent decades. That's one of the reasons the Open Discourse Coalition exists. It's one of the reasons you featured our work on your own podcast a few months ago. What are you seeing in terms of the donors that you work with at Donors Trust, in terms of the problems that exist in higher education, and also how you're working with those donors to solve those problems?
Well, I think anybody who's listening to this podcast is probably pretty open to the problems that are out there. We see them on the news every day. I don't necessarily need to belabor that. What I think we really need to look at is, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And there's an instinct in donors to, when the appeal letter comes to for their university, their alma mater, their kid's alma mater, they write the check, they send it off, and that's fine. That's great. What we really try to encourage is just taking a little more nuance in that, taking a little more specificity. So actually one rule we have at Donors Trust, which is a little unique, is we don't allow folks to just give into the annual fund at their university. So you wanted to give a gift to Bucknell and just, unrestricted, here you go. We encourage you to say, why don't you direct that to a particular program at Bucknell, a professor, the Open Discourse Coalition, the golf team, something that allows you to actually indicate to the university what your donor intent is. Because then if the university goes off and does something they shouldn't do with it, or you see that the program you funded isn't as funded as you thought it might be because of your gift, you can go to the university and say, hey, did they get my money? Is this program that I allocated getting the resources that it's supposed to do? And you can push on them in that way. So that's one thing, is being a bit more specific when you're giving to your alma mater. If you are going to support your alma mater, then make sure it's targeted. The other thing is giving kind of around the alma mater, right? And this particularly applies to universities that aren't doing great stuff, that are getting off the road a little bit. And so it's finding the programs that are helping, but that aren't necessarily the 501c3 of the university. So take, for example, student journalism, right? The Fund for American Studies, a great organization that we both know, has done a lot of work in recent years to help start up, seed, grow some of these more conservative-leaning student-run newspapers on campuses all across the country, right? Those generally are not, some of them are programs of the university, but some of them are their own 501c3 organization. Support that, right? You're still supporting your university, but you're supporting the thing you actually want to do. And you can even tell the university, hey, if you were doing things better, if you were actually allowing the Student Activities Fund to support a program like this, I would give to you, the university, and pad your bottom line. But instead, I'm giving it directly to them. Let the university know, and that puts pressure, particularly if you're a larger donor, a donor with some influence. You can push them in a little bit of a way, or funding organizations like Institute for Humane Studies or ACTA or other groups that are putting pressure on university, FIRE, right? All the groups that you used to work for, that are changing the culture on campus, open discourse, right? That have their own 501c3s that move campuses in a more positive direction. So those are the two things. Specify if you're going to give to the school, and then go around the school to still accomplish the same ends, but more directly with the organizations that are actually changing the students' lives for the better.
One of the devices I tend to hear from donors in that regard, Peter, I'm curious to hear what your and Donors Trust stance is on it, is one you named, but one you didn't name. One is I'll give to the sports team. You address that. But the other is I'll endow a faculty chair. Oh, usually what that means is I'll write a big check to the university. It'll sit in the endowment. And then every year they'll use the throw off, whether it's 5% or whatever, to fund a faculty position. And oftentimes donors will try to say, I'm going to direct that it be in, the study of the American Revolution or something that was important to them, something that's in keeping with their donor intent, something that they think is lacking at the university. If somebody came to you with an idea like that, or to one of your colleagues, what would you say?
We'd say that's great. And let's put some paperwork around it and figure out how do we make sure that the university is actually doing what it needs to do. So often those types of things are best done creating some kind of memorandum of understanding, an MOU, right? This is pretty standard. Even when it's not done well, that's pretty good. But the second piece of it is either spacing out the dollars or requiring some kind of feedback mechanism from the school so that that the money's actually being spent in the way it's supposed to. So a donor advised fund is a helpful tool for this, right? The donor advised fund in the school can enter into an agreement on your behalf that says we want to fund this program and we're going to do it for X number of years. And, maybe that half of, let's say you're giving $50,000 a year and half of it is current spending, but the other half builds up an endowment for the long term, right? And you do that over X number of years, you build an endowment so that this can go on forever. But every year you're asking, are you doing these things? Is somebody hired? What are they doing? What's the course uptake amongst students, et cetera? Whatever the things that are important to you in terms of metrics. And then a donors trust or whoever is kind of stewarding this MOU says, okay, great, here's the next tranche of money. Or, okay, great, we won't activate whatever mechanism that might be in place to kill the whole thing if they are actually not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
So earlier you mentioned, Peter, that one of the things you advise donors is that there's lots of nuance in these things. I think I heard a nuance in what you said, and I either want to bring it out or I want you to tell me that I was wrong. Usually, I would say the traditional way to do something like what we just talked about is whatever the check is, you write a big check to the university controls it, it sits in the endowment. Now, yes, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, there's some type of recourse. It usually involves lawyers and courts. I think you're suggesting that donors do something different entirely, which is you still write the check, you still get the tax deduction, but the initial check goes to a third party, in this case, a donor advised fund, and that there are performance metrics. The university eventually gets the money, but there's annual or semi-annual, whatever, accountability, which can only really, I think what you're saying is, have any teeth in it if that third party controls the original corpus and the university has to actually satisfy the donor intent in order to get the successive payments. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is an important nuance that you're right. You can, by putting in a donor advised fund or some other mechanism, but that certainly is an easy one. Yeah, you can, if you need to give $20 million right then and there, then you can get your tax deduction. You can check that box. But do you really want to give that whole 20 million to the university up front? No, give them $1 million a year for 20 years or 2 million for 10 years or whatever you decide it is, so that the university has to build up the muscle memory of actually doing the right thing. If you just write them a check today, they can say lots of good things for you. Maybe they'll give you a reception when they open the building or launch the scholarship or whatever it is. And maybe they'll bring you back the next year. And then your memory slowly starts to fade. You probably keep getting invited to things, but they're on to the next big thing. better if they have to be held accountable every single year and remember, oh, not only did Mr. Mitchell do something very nice for our university, he also wanted to make sure these things happened. And are they happening? Yes. Okay, good. Because that means we get the next tranche of money. And like I said, it's building their muscle memory, their habit of doing the right thing that then can extend after the life of it, right? Or make it time bound. We talked about that earlier, but I think that's the important thing. Let them build that muscle memory of being right.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance, Peter, and it's part of why I'm grateful you took the time for this conversation. The folks I know who are listening to our conversation want to do good things for college students for many years to come. The question is, how do you do it? What tactics, what tools are available? Good news is those tools have changed. There are tools available now that really were not available 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. The concerning news is it's all the more urgent that you use those tools and that you use them very wisely, because the institutions whose students you want to impact for the good have changed. And we all just have to be aware of that and
Right.
use our tools accordingly.
And by the way, then if at year 10 of this 20-year plan, the university decides, actually, we're not going to teach humanities anymore, and that's what you've been funding, which is unfortunately happening at some schools, then you can say, well, then our MOU no longer applies. I'm going to take those dollars. I'm going to find another place to do the rest of this. Maybe even take the professor, right? Or if your goals change halfway through and you say, this was meant to help people understand the American Revolution, but really they need to understand this other nuance on top of it as well. And how about we renegotiate so that you keep getting the money? Let's also add this. They're going to be much more likely to listen to you if they don't already have all of your money.
Yeah, and I'd argue there's a positive side of it too, Peter, whether it's working through a donor advised fund, whether it's working through another type of 501c3 like the Open Discourse Coalition. By giving wisely, by using some of these tools, not only can you protect yourself against downside risk, but there's potential upside as well. Other donors can hear about what you're doing and put resources behind it. If, God willing, the university in question, whatever it is, responds well and leans in and says, oh, look, there's student demand for this type of activity, we're going to grow this program that this first donor funded. Those things can happen too. And I think we are seeing those happen. One of my favorite examples is the one we talked about earlier, the newly named Snow Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University. It began as a small program funded in part by the Searle Freedom Trust and some other organizations that you and I both know. Has attracted some incredible support recently, including from the family that named it, the Snows, who happen to be friends of some Bucknellians, so I hope are watching this, my good friends in Memphis. That's a great example of how a small idea that began with the right tools is now gathering scale and setting an example, not only at one pretty large university that neither of us went to, but we still have to admit that they did a good job, but can even become a beacon for what other schools can do. Now,
Absolutely.
We could talk about that for a long time, and next time we have a beer, we should. Having said that, there was another topic that we said we were going to talk about that is very time sensitive, and we should turn our attention to. You and your colleagues at Donors Trust, Peter, recently put together a guide to changes in tax law that are occurring because of the big, beautiful bill, which the president signed earlier this year. That was, I would always love to have a conversation with you, but that was the real impetus that caused both of us to say, we need to have this conversation today, and we need to release it ASAP because December 31st is almost upon us. I would love for you to take a minute and summarize what is happening with the big, beautiful bill, what it has to do with donors and their choices that they have to make before December 31st. And as you shared with some of the topics we discussed earlier, what are you hearing from the folks you work with terms of how important these changes are, what ways they're impacting behavior. I find this is a very underappreciated topic, and that's why I'm grateful that you and your colleagues prepared a guide and that you're willing to walk some of the friends of ODC through it today.
Sure thing. So, one of the things that we often say around donors trust is that nobody should, at least, give to charity because of the tax deduction, right? You shouldn't give away $1 to get 33 cents back or whatever the right number is. That's not good, sound money management. You do it because you want to add some value in some place. You have a heart for a cause. You want to see some kind of impact take place. That is your return on investment. But the reason these tax questions matter is because if you do it right, you can actually give more than you otherwise thought you might be able to by just managing it in the right way. And you're right, because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there are a few changes that even if it doesn't alter your plan, it's worth knowing and asking yourself the question of, okay, should I do anything before those things take effect January 1 so that I can have a greater charitable impact, as well as helping myself by benefiting on the tax front. So a couple of the changes that took place. One, probably doesn't apply to many people on the call, but there's a new non-itemizer deduction that'll take effect next year. Set that one aside, but worth mentioning because it's important. There is now a giving floor and a giving ceiling, again, starting January 1, 2026. And this is where it may matter for some people. So the giving floor means the first 0.05 or 0.5% of the money you give away in a year essentially doesn't count towards the deductibility. So my wife and I put money in our donor advised fund every month based on what we earn and how much we give away, et cetera. We figured that the gift we make in January just isn't going to get counted for tax deductibility purposes. February, March, on the rest, all that will count. So, that's a bummer in that it doesn't necessarily help your taxes. Probably doesn't change things too much. But if you want to avoid that, you may want to front load some of your giving this year so that you can maximize your tax deductibility this year, knowing it's going to be a little different next year. The other piece, and this may affect some of the folks on your call, is for those in the 37% tax bracket, there's going to be a ceiling on what they can deduct. They can only count up to 35% of that. So, if you give away $1, you get 37 cents back in terms of the deduction. They're only going to get 35 cents back. Again, not a huge deal, not a huge change, but it's the first time that we've seen this floor and the ceiling there. And we outlined this in that guide, and I think you'll link that in your show notes. There were a couple other positive things in terms of making permanent the adjusted gross income ceiling of 60% that you can count towards your deductibility. So for a public charity or a donor advised fund, you can deduct up to 30% of your AGI for stocks and up to 60% for cash. Those numbers are lower for giving to a private foundation. Those are the big change. Well, and then the other big change that's worth mentioning, and it's already in effect, is the SALT deduction. That went from 10,000 to, I believe is it 30,000 or 40,000? I continue to get that mixed up in my mind. But whatever that new raised deduction is, then that's in effect this year. And that may also play into how you want to think about, okay, what is your deduction this year versus next year, et cetera. And those are the big changes, and happy to dive into those deeper to the extent I can because I'm not a tax expert.
Well, and I'll just ask you that, Peter. If someone's attention was piqued by what you just said, yes, we are going to put your guide in the show notes, and we've already distributed to the members of the ODC advisory board. So let's assume they've already read the guide. What would you advise them to do?
So there's a couple tactics from that. One is talk to your tax advisor and see what may maximize your giving. Two, one strategy that some people may have heard of is a bunching strategy. This was all the rage back in 2017 when the initial Trump tax cuts came into effect, which essentially means front loading 2, maybe 3 years of charitable giving into 1 year, so that you can maximize what you're itemizing. And then the next year, assuming your taxes work out this way, then you just take the standard deduction. Now, this is a really great tool if you have a donor advised fund, because that's where you can park those charitable dollars and then give them away in a steady cadence over the next 2, 3 years, whatever it is. If you're somebody who's on a fixed income or retired or just not doesn't have a lot of cash flow and has a lower tax basis, that where this you actually might take the standard deduction, then that's a good tool to know. That's probably the biggest one that I'd flag in terms of thinking through the timing and how to handle some of these charitable changes.
Great. We all know that was a really important law that was signed, but these weren't the big ticket provisions that most people were talking and thinking about. So I'm grateful for you and your colleagues for flagging them. If anybody listening has more questions, you're a very kind individual, and I know how to get you, and anybody listening knows how to get me. So if anybody has further questions for Peter, reach out to me. But I think we addressed that important topic, and I think we can leave it there. Peter, if it's all right with you, I thought we would end with a little rapid fire round. As you know, there are three questions that I always ask everyone who appears on this humble program, and it is a delight to be able to ask them of you. The first is, especially given your experience at Donors Trust in philanthropy, you have a unique vantage point on what's going on in higher education. In light of all that, why do you think the mission of our organization, the Open Discourse Coalition, matters these days?
I can remember when I was in college, and I was a theater political science major. My professors were not aligned with me. And this was, I started Davidson in 1999, graduated in 2003, a different time, different era. But I never had any issues arguing with my professors, even my theater professors, about politics. They knew that I was conservative. They knew who I was. I was not afraid to be who I was, and debate in class and have these conversations and push and prod. I don't know if I could do that now. I really don't know if I could do that now. I shudder to think of the students that have to hide their convictions or just have to say, why is it that way? Why is, you just made this really very progressive point, but why? Why do you believe that? And that should be the goal of college. That should be the conversations that you're having in these classes. And instead, it becomes a platform for too many professors, or, as I think we've talked about before, a bigger problem is the students shouting you down and saying you are not allowed to have those thoughts. You are not allowed to ask those questions. So to me, that's why it's important. We should, I don't want to live in the past and be all nostalgic, but something was working back when you and I were in school where we could have some of these debates. I know you had some rough spots having some of those debates. You pushed harder than I did. But man, to think of what we would be going through if we were who we are in school today. And that's why it's so important to have groups like what you're doing there with Open Discourse and some of these other college institutions that are challenging the fundamental assumption that you shouldn't ask questions, because you absolutely should.
Thank you, Peter. There are a number of people who are involved in ODC who went to college in the same era as you did, who are on the other side of the tracks from you politically, and their answers as to why they're involved are actually very similar, because they also remember that era when, whether you were on the left or you were on the right, it was just different to have debate. It was different to disagree, whether that's with fellow students, whether that's with professors. And as we keep talking about in this conversation, something has changed and something needs to be done about it. So that's I love the poignancy of that answer. All right, I got two more for you, my friend. What is a book that you recommend, a great book that you recommend to our listeners today?
So this was a very challenging one because there's obviously lots of great books. So I'm gonna kind of go with a recency bias to a book that I really enjoyed. I'm slowly reading through all the presidential biographies, and I've gotten to Garfield, and so still a ways to go. But I recently read Candace Millard's Destiny of the Republic, which, Garfield is not a president that many people remember, partially because he was only president in the course of 1 year, didn't really want to be president, probably could have been a really great president, but he was assassinated. And so this book tells the story both of his rise and how he pushed back, how he was this different politician from everything that we know a politician to be today, in terms of his humility, his respect for the constitutional order, and then the story of this medical disaster that turned the way people thought about medicine, and also the assassin, and completely upended the way people get hired in these jobs. I know that it may all seem a little mundane, but it's a inflection point in this country that it's a good reminder that just because things are the way they are, something will eventually happen big that's going to change things. And what it'll be in higher ed, I don't know. What it'll be in all these other issues, I don't know. But the book reminded that sometimes events matter, and we need to be ready to take advantage of them.
It's part of why I love asking this question. You can never predict what people are going to say. No one would have said he's going to recommend a book on James Garfield. That is awesome. And you know that you have a receptive audience in that for me, because I actually have read another book on James Garfield. So this is a conversation.
And Candice Millard is a fabulous author. I just read another book by her on Winston Churchill. Like she's awesome.
I don't know her, but it sounds like I'm going to get to know her. Thank you. That's great. Okay, last one. Who is your favorite world historical figure?
I mean, it's going to sound trite, but I think it's George Washington. Like, we all know the stories of George Washington, but the more I hear about him, the more research comes out about him, the more books I read about him, more books I read around him, he is who we think he is. He is this humble leader without whom we probably couldn't have the nation that we did. We got darn lucky that we had somebody who just wanted to be a good statesman and a good military leader and a good father figure to his men in the field, a good father figure to his country, informing it. I would like to get under the hood and try to understand how he got there. But the more I read about it, the more it seems like he just got there by being who he was. So I would love to have that conversation with him.
Peter, I think you're going to inspire me to have a new rule in these discussions, which is I'm going to ban people from starting by saying that their answer is trite, because almost everyone does it. I've had other George Washington answers that started the same way. I think you're the second, which, by the way, I agree with you. There's no country if there's no George Washington. I think we've had at least one, maybe two people say Jesus. Same thing. They caveat it. They say this is going to sound obvious. There is no obvious answer to this question. Oh, by the way, there's been all sorts of other answers you never would have expected. But I think you're going to inspire me. The next time I ask, I'm going to say, you're not allowed to say your answer is trite or to be expected, because it's not. And that's part of the fun of it. I love your answer. Knowing you, I think it's beautiful that my friend who began as a Georgian seems to be becoming more and more and more of a Virginian. You grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, but now you live in the Blue Ridge, beautiful part of the world. So it seems like it's growing on you. And I'm grateful that you would share that not trite answer, and also that you would share all of your knowledge with the Friends of the Open Discourse Coalition today. Thanks so much, Peter, for taking the time. And I'm hopeful that not just on this short-term issue with the big, beautiful bill, but also with the bigger picture of how do we ensure that we advance our values when we set out to be philanthropic, that you've given a lot of people some really great tools to do good today. So thank you so much, my friend.
Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you for all you're doing with Open Discourse Coalition, all you've done with the many hats you've worn in the past. And thank you to your donors. We started this conversation, you were talking about, they're thinking about donor intent, et cetera. I just want to encourage that and continue to everyone listening. Think about what you want to do with your dollars. The dollars are yours, and your philanthropy is a form of free speech, and you should use it in a way that drives your values and makes this country better.
Awesome, Peter. Thanks again. Let's do this another time. See ya.
Sounds great. Thanks. Bye.